Hi, I'm Patrick Scott. Welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of interest groups, what interest groups are, what they do, and how they operate in our system of government. One of the things that I'd like to give you as an example by starting out is just to think about how, on the one hand, a president, when a president is campaigning for office, may make certain promises. I'm thinking, for example, with Obama and Barack Obama and healthcare reform. And he makes a lot of promises on the campaign trail and says we want to have fundamental reform of healthcare. And the people vote him in part because they may agree with his platform about healthcare reform. Now, what's interesting, and this is why I bring this up in terms of the concept of interest groups, what's interesting is he's urging Congress to pass some type of healthcare reform bill into law that he can sign into law. And what will be interesting to see, or as an interesting case study here, is that to the extent that that law, the question becomes, to what extent does that law actually reflect his campaign promises, or to what extent is it significantly moderated by other kinds of pressures that are placed upon Congress by interest groups. And so I think if you look at healthcare reform, it's a very interesting case study that indicates, on the one hand, sort of a majority opinion asking for some fundamental reform in healthcare because of the healthcare crisis and the affordability of healthcare, and at the same time, to what extent it actually gets reflected in a bill which underscores the role and importance of interest groups. And you can take this in terms of any area, be it healthcare reform or any other kinds of areas of policy, to see how strong and important interest groups are to our political system. Now, as this might also suggest to you in a lot of ways, interest groups really fit into the idea of this pluralist model of democracy that we've been talking about. Pluralism and interest groups kind of go hand in hand. We live in a pluralist society, and basically, in a pluralist system, the idea behind that is a system where there are many groups that are operating, and they have access to government officials, and they compete with one another to influence public policy. And so, in a lot of ways, under a pluralist system, in the ideal sense, you can think of a pluralist system as one where there's lots of different groups that are out there that people are part of, and people join, and they channel their preferences through those interest groups and through interest group leaders. And the interest group leaders then press their demands upon government, both in Congress and also in bureaucracy, to help effectuate change in a way that's in accordance with the interests or preferences of the people who are in those interest groups. So that's the idea behind this then. People the basic assumptions of pluralism is that there are many individuals who are active in multiple and overlapping groups and associations, and public policy is made through the pushing and tugging of these groups to have their interests heard and channeled. We talked about the idea before in an earlier class about how tobacco policy in a lot of ways is a good example to show a reflection of the pushing and pulling of these different interest groups, so that our tobacco policy on the one hand encourages the consumption of tobacco, while in many other cases it discourages the consumption of tobacco. And again, I think that's a good example of this idea of how interest groups at work and at play. Now, as we're talking about this pluralist system, again, it's a nice, important component of democracy because it encourages active participation and people are playing a role in our political system. Some critics suggest that one of the basic flaws of our pluralist system is that many people are actually not very well represented this way. In fact, many minorities, the poor, and others are left out of this system. And so because of this, several people believe that our system of pluralism is really comprised of elites. That is, the people who actively participate in our system of government tend to be among the more wealthy, the more powerful, and the more privileged in our society. And as far as the ordinary citizens concerned, or those who are not politically well connected, they are often not well represented in this arena. And the poor and minorities are represented even less so. These are the groups that are much less likely to have a steel and glass office building and a team of registered lobbyists to speak for them in Washington. Okay, so again, on the one hand, there's some advantages that people see about interest groups, how as interest groups flourish, it helps to encourage and facilitate participation by many different groups and individuals in our society. And then there's the critics who suggest that perhaps interest groups are not as good as you might think because of the fact that they tend to be represent the interests of those who are more economically and politically connected, and so therefore how good for democracy is that? So let's first of all then talk about, on the one hand we talk about how this notion of interest groups is really part of this pluralist system of our government. Let me talk for a minute about what is an interest group, just to make sure that we understand what that is. It's basically, an interest group is any organized group of individuals who share one or more common goals and who seek to influence government decision making. When we think about interest groups, we think about, for example, the National Rifle Association, the American Medical Association, the National Association of Realtors. I mean, there's so many alphabet soup names of groups that are out there. But that's basically, it's a collection of individuals who have a common purpose, and what that common purpose is to influence public policy. And in fact, one of the interesting points to point out here is that to what extent does an interest group differ from a political party? Well, in our discussion of political parties, you know that the primary goal of political parties is to get candidates elected, to win elections, to help, to get candidates who share the values and the goals of the party, get them elected, and then they operate and run government. Now, unlike parties, interest groups are much more limited in terms of what they want to achieve. They're not interested in the outcome, in winning elections per se, although they are interested in, certainly in terms of who does win an election, but they're more interested actually in terms of influencing public policies. Many interest groups, in fact, will give money liberally to both Democratic candidates as well as conservative candidates. You'll see Republican candidates. You'll see, for example, some of the top political action committees, which are basically the fundraising arm of an interest group, advocating for certain issues, and they're happy to give money to any candidate that shares their goals. You don't have to be a Republican, you don't have to be a Democrat, it doesn't really matter. As long as you share the goals of that interest group, chances are they'll be providing you money to help you with your campaign. So unlike parties, interest groups really advocate for more of a limited set of demands rather than broad-based goals of a party. And interest groups really try to influence members of Congress, but also members of the bureaucracy, top officials in the bureaucracy, as part of their trying to influence public policies, because public policies may be created in laws and represented in laws, but as they are implemented in bureaucracies, in the federal bureaucracy, there's a lot of leeway that administrative officials have, and that's where interest groups can also play a very important role in terms of trying to influence the outcome of certain policies as regulations are being created that flow from that legislation. So interest groups, they come in all shapes and sizes. They represent all sorts of interest. But if we were to sort of in a rough kind of way characterize broadly the different kinds of interest groups that are out there, I think there are three general categories of interest groups that we can come up with. The first and most important is this idea of economic interest groups. But there's also citizen activist interest groups as well as government-related interest groups. Now, let me talk about each of these. So I'll start out first of all talking about the economic interest groups. These are obviously going to be the most powerful interest groups that you see out there. These are the groups that represent business, labor, professional groups, agricultural groups, trade associations, and they are the most powerful type because all of these are tied to some kind of economic interest. So you have business associations, for example. One of the most important and most famous is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Very, very powerful interest group. Trade associations that tend to represent specific industries, and these would, for example, include groups like the Computer Software Manufacturers Association, who want to make sure that the laws reflect the interest of computer software manufacturers. You have the groups that range from the National Association of Sugar Growers to the Potato Chip Snack Food Association. Any kind of type of business or trade is likely to have some type of interest groups associated with that. Certainly, as I mentioned, professional associations such as the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association that represents the interest of lawyers, the National Association of Realtors, again, are all these professional groups that represent again, tied specifically to those specific professional interests. And of course, you also have many labor groups that are out there too, the AFL, the CIO, that are tied to unions and many other unions too, the United Auto Workers and so forth. All of these are part of that larger category of economic interest groups because they are very much tied to the economic interests that are involved in those specific areas. All right, so again, these are the most powerful. These are the ones that you tend to see quite a bit of and can have a very important, significant influence in terms of how public policies are shaped to represent their prerogatives. Now, besides the economic interest groups, you have citizen activist groups. Now, these are groups that concern themselves with social issues that affect the public at large. And in a lot of ways, you have kind of two subsets of citizen activist groups. You've got public interest groups and single issue groups. Public interest groups are concerned with sort of the public interest as a whole. And I think of one of the ones that really stand out is the idea of something called common cause. Another one are consumer groups, for example, that are sponsored by people like Ralph Nader, who's a very famous consumer advocate. But these are public interest groups trying to concerned about achieving the public interest as a whole. Positive reform in Washington, D.C., making sure that we have tax reform, for example, would be an example of public interest groups. Now, besides that, another example of a citizen interest group would be something called the single issue group. Now, these are groups that have they're more framed along specific narrow interests. I think of, for example, the Christian Coalition. That would be, it has a very, either a single set or a narrow set of issues that they're trying to promote. In this case, making sure that pro-family values, for example, are promulgated in our laws and our regulations. I think of the National Abortion Rights Action League, the NARL, which is specifically for helping to make sure that our laws allow women a right to choose. The NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, again, wanting to reform, decriminalize marijuana across the country. But these are groups, these single issue groups are groups that tend to focus, again, on a single issue or a small set of issues. Again, the Christian Coalition, prayer in schools or abortion would be some of the issues that they would be concerned with. Then you also have, besides that, advocacy groups. And advocacy groups are actually those who serve as advocates for individuals who alone may be unable to represent their own interests. So I think of, for example, historically the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. They're historically involved in helping to advance their civil liberties and rights. The Child Welfare League, the Children's Defense Fund. These, again, are groups that advocate for individuals who alone may not have historically been able to represent their own interest or effectively, or even currently too, such as the Children's Defense Fund. So you have the citizen activist groups, okay? You have the economic interest groups, and then the third general category are what I call the government-related interest groups, all right? And now these cover, again, a sort of a broad spectrum, but any particular group that's related to advocating on behalf of some other government entity would fall into this category of a government-related interest group. This would include, for example, lobbyists that represent foreign or state governments. Did you know that we have in Washington, D.C. lobbyists who are hired by other countries such as Japan and China that lobby on behalf of those countries to make sure that our trade policies reflect their interests? We have lobbyists from all the states making sure that, like for example in Missouri, that Missouri's interests are represented in terms of the money that is in terms of the budget of the United States government, making sure that the laws that are passed and the budgets that come along with those laws reflect the prerogatives of Missouri and other states. You have, for example, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is an interest group that represents mayors all across the country, making sure that their cities have their prerogatives. You have the International City Management Association, which includes a strong component here in the United States, which is a very important interest group that represents the city employees. You have the groups that represent state, federal, and municipal employees all across the United States that are very, very powerful. You have the National Governors Association as well. And as you know, as an example of this too, Missouri State University. Missouri State University, as a state entity, actually hires an interest group to represent the interests of Missouri State in Washington, D.C. Right now, currently, we have an agreement with a group called the Livingston Group. The Livingston Group is a consultancy interest group basically located in Washington, D.C., comprised of a lot of powerful, many of whom are powerful officials, many of whom are former representatives. It's headed up by Robert Livingston, and Robert Livingston is a former representative from Louisiana. Robert Livingston became Speaker of the House. He's a Republican. He became Speaker of the House following the resignation of Newt Gingrich back in the 1990s, mid-1990s. And he was Speaker of the House for a short period of time. There were some scandals associated. He had, I think, an extramarital affair, and then he stepped down. But formed the Livingston Group. Stayed in Washington, formed the Livingston Group, and contracts out with a lot of different government entities, one of which, of course, is Missouri State University. And the idea is this, and this is the decision that officials here at Missouri State University will make, is they say, well, for example, the money that we pay out to them to represent our interests, does it come back in the way of grants, in terms of federal projects and federal grants? And if we get a return on our investment, then it's a good decision. And up to this point, Missouri State has been fairly happy with that arrangement because of the fact that for every dollar that they have, that the university has spent in terms of this lobbying firm, it has actually translated to several dollars back in terms of returns, in terms of federal grants. And they've tied those expenditures to the benefits from that. We actually have, even at the state level, we have someone who represents Missouri State University's interest in Jefferson City. His name is Jerry Birch, and we've had him on a contract basis for several years, and his job, in part, is to represent the interests of Missouri State University in Jeff City. But anyway, so lobbyists that represent any of these kinds of government entities, even including Missouri State University as a state government, would be considered part of the government-related interest group that fits into that. So interest groups come in all sizes and shapes, as we said. The three different types, again, are government-related. We've got the citizen activist groups, which have those three subsets of public interest, single issue, and advocacy groups. And then we also have the economic interest groups as well, which tend to, again, be the most powerful type. Now, that brings us to a question here, and that is, first of all, why are there so many interest groups? I mean, because there really are many interest groups. There are thousands of interest groups all across our country. And in a lot of ways, let me give you a couple of reasons why that would be. I'll give you three basic reasons, two of which relate to our political party and our party system. But the first one, the easiest explanation, is that we have a diverse society, very diverse society, and because of that we have diverse people with many diverse interests that go all the way, and because of that, that diversity and so forth goes all the way back to, I think, harkens back to the writings of Madison and others in the Federalist Papers that talk about the idea of factions. There are so many factions, and even back then at the founding of our country, our founding fathers recognized that these factions or groups would play a very important role in our system. So we have a diverse society, and so as many interests that we have groups to represent those diverse interests. And so that would certainly be one of the reasons why. Now, as part of this too, if you think about how our system, our political system is structured, we have a very decentralized political system, as you know. We have, in our discussion of federalism, we talked about the fact that we have not only the federal government, but we have all these state governments, as well as county governments, as well as city governments, as well as all these special districts that overlap different city and county lines, and so such as a port authority, a water authority, public housing authorities, and those kinds of things. And so because of that, we have all of these different kinds of entities, and so having a decentralized system like that, it really contributes to the proliferation of interest groups, because it multiplies sort of the points at which groups can gain access to our government, because there are so many different points of access at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level. It basically creates a natural breeding ground, if you will, for many different types of interest groups. Okay, so you may remember in our discussion of federalism how power was dispersed horizontally and how it was dispersed vertically. So there are multiple power systems throughout our system, and people have multiple opportunities for access to that power. And so because of that, the more chances there are for people to influence public policy, the more interest groups that will be there to influence public policy. All right, so we have, again, a diverse society, we have a decentralized system, the nature of our system that contributes to the proliferation of interest groups. And then we also have two particular components of our party system and its characteristics that also contribute to the nature of interest groups or to the proliferation of interest groups in our political system. So, in terms of the party system specifically, as you know, we have a weak party system. Now think about this. Where parties are strong, interest groups work through the party system. But where parties are weak, interest groups will often bypass them and operate directly on the government. All right? So because of that, like for example, let's look at Chicago. For many years as being part of that party machine, and particularly the Democratic Party has been very, very strong. Labor unions, business associations, and citizens groups have often had to work with the party on its own terms. And again, you even see this in many European countries as well, where they have a strong party system. And where they have a strong party system, interest groups tend to be less frequent, less powerful, and there's just not as much of a need for that because they have that strong party system. The point I want to suggest to you here again is with a weak party system, in the nature of our political system here, parties play a role, but not as much of a role because there are other actors in our arena. There are political action committees that are a reflection in a lot of ways of interest groups. So you have, again, not party-centered campaigns, but candidate-centered campaigns. And so the nature of our party system basically, again, encourages the proliferation of interest groups to work in our system. All right, now there's a second component to that party system as well. It's not only because parties are weak, that allows other interest groups to work beyond and outside the party system, but also, again, the nature of our party system not only is it weak, but because it's a broad-based two-party system. And so because of that, you know, our parties are more concerned about getting votes and winning elections. Our parties are willing to trade off viewpoints and ideology for more votes. And again, that's the nature of our party system. Again, like our Republicans and Democratic parties are like two large umbrellas that really try to attract as many voters in the middle of the ideological spectrum as possible. So because of that, some people who feel very passionately about specific interest may feel like the party is really kind of the party that they are a part of is really not representing their interest very well. And so because the parties are not giving enough attention to some of these specific interests, interest groups may really form outside the party structure. In our discussion of political parties, we talk about the idea of how some third parties may form because there may be some people who feel very passionately about some issues who feel like their particular party is really letting them down because they're not really adhering or trying to incorporate their views as much as they should be. And so in situations like this, interest groups really come and play a natural kind of, if you will, sort of a release valve for that frustration because people can say, well, the party's not really adequately providing for my interest, but I can join this interest over here and I can know that this interest will reflect my views even better. And so in a lot of ways, the sort of the broad-based nature of our party system, the fact that parties here in America are not ideological, really allows narrow interest groups, if you will, to flourish in this kind of system, okay? And again, in Europe you have a different picture. There they have a multi-party system. The parties tend to be much more narrow in their focus. They have less of a broad-based appeal over there, so they cater to very specific and narrow interests. And in that kind of situation, those interests are effectively channeled into the political process through the parties, all right? So over in many European countries where you have a strong party system or in a multi-party system where ideological parties are operating and flourishing, there really is less of a need for interest groups over in many European systems, all right? So that's why, again, so in terms of our parties, the fact that we have a weak party system, so naturally gives a lot of allowance to the formation of interest groups, and the fact that not only is it a party a weak system, but also the fact that we have a broad-based party system that's not ideological. Again, those two kinds of conditions provide a lot of fermenting ground that allows interest groups to form and flourish in our system. And just to give you an example of that, over the last 30 years or so, interest groups have really proliferated. In fact, over 70% of all interest groups that work in Washington today began really since about 1970 or so. And today there are over 7,000 groups that are represented in Washington. So that's one of those are some of the reasons why we have so many different interest groups in our society. Now, what is it that interest groups do? It's a natural question that comes from that. Not only, what are interest groups and why are there so many interest groups, but what is it exactly that interest groups do? And so we're going to talk about basically 3 different functions of interest groups, all right? Number 1, interest groups engage in lobbying, okay, in the practice of lobbying. All right, what that basically means is that interest groups will hire lobbyists to serve as a spokesperson for that group. And their purpose of the lobbyists is to influence both legislators and government decision makers in the executive branch. When I say that again, I'm meaning bureaucracy here, all right, officials in bureaucracy. Often these lobbyists are former government officials themselves. I talked about, for example, the Livingston Group, all right, headed by Robert Livingston, a former member of the House of Representatives, former Speaker of the House. So former members of Congress, once they leave Congress, many of them will stay around in Washington and become part of an interest group. Many actually former top officials in various agencies in our federal government. Once they leave their position, they may actually then stay in Washington and work for our various lobbying firms. So former members of Congress or top bureaucratic officials who know how things are done in their agencies will happen. And I'll give you a quick example. I used to work in Washington for a number of years for the Department of Commerce and specifically for the Bureau of Industry and Security. And one of the officials, back at the time I was working, this is actually part of the International Trade Administration, and it's gone through some changes since then. But one of the top political appointees, a former assistant secretary in a top area, and therefore a top official, who was involved in trade policy, after he left his position, he went in to work for a lobbyist representing the trade interest for the nation of Japan. There are some other people who actually work on the inside. In fact, when I was working for the Bureau of Export Administration, this is again formerly the International Trade Administration becomes the Bureau of Export Administration, now it's the Bureau of Industry and Security. But as it was under and called the Bureau of Export Administration, one of the functions of the Bureau of Export Administration, even today the Bureau of Industry and Security, is to make sure that the export of products and technologies, or products that embody high technologies, are controlled and regulated so that we don't export highly sensitive technologies to places that we don't trust. So for example, we don't want to be exporting supercomputers that embody the latest in technology to countries that have a history of supporting terrorist nations, obviously, or missile defense. And so we try to be very, very cautious about that. People who work on the inside of these agencies who know how these processes operate will often interface with business manufacturers or exporters, and in the process they develop relationships, and they will tell some of these, actually some people who come in and who are even at lower levels in bureaucracy, they'll say, hey, come work for us. You know how the process on the inside works. You know how, for example, the export licensing process works. You can help and help make sure that our export license applications get through the agency in a timely fashion. So since you're an expert in this area, why don't you come work for us and we'll double your salary. And so again, lobbyists are not really just always the highest officials. They can actually be even lower level officials in bureaucracy who have a very good knowledge of the inner workings of the processes of that agency. And the interest groups that deal with that agency may hire those individuals, pay them handsomely as a way to encourage them to come and work for the agency. So again, you can see that's just one simple example of how that works. But basically then lobbyists will try to influence not only members of Congress but also members of bureaucracy as well. Currently there are over 38,000 registered lobbyists in Washington alone. So you can see the place is teeming with lobbyists. Oftentimes too, the contacts of lobbyists are made with legislative staff members or again, or bureaucratic, bureaucrats, technical bureaucrats, than actual members of Congress or the highest officials. And I'll give you an example here, even on the congressional side. Before I worked for the Department of Commerce, I worked for a brief time serving as an intern for our senator from Georgia. He has since stepped down. His name was Sam Nunn from Georgia. And as I worked for him, had gained some very, very interesting experience and very valuable experience. But one of the things I was very impressed with was the fact that how that receptions, interest groups were always throwing parties and receptions for members of Congress. And I remember as an intern, some of the staff, the permanent staff people would come to us and say, hey, do you want to go to this reception for free tonight? And you'll have a great time, you've got free food, it's wonderful, you'll enjoy it. And so we would all go up there, as interns, and some of the staff people would go there as well, obviously, too. And if at these receptions being hosted by the interest groups, or it could be a trade association or whatever, they would see who you're working for. And if you were working for a powerful member of the Senate or the House of Representatives, they would come to you and talk to you and try to develop and strike up a relationship with you. And so they would basically, and they would say, well, tell me what you do and tell me what you're involved with, and they may offer to take you to lunch somewhere. And basically try to give you information to influence the staff person to support their position. I'll give you another quick example too, besides going out to lunch and having these receptions. But even if you work for an interest group, if you're a lobbyist, for example, you may actually come, let's say, for example, you go to, you're in Washington, and let's say that you want to make contact with Claire McCaskill, our senator from Missouri. You knock on the door and you say, I'd like to, we represent, for example, the American Banking Association. We'd like to talk to her about maybe some banking legislation that's being considered right now in Congress, and we'd like to talk to her to share with her our views about a specific piece of legislation. We'll call it Senate Bill number 222 that deals with some fundamental banking reforms that maybe have been a reflection of some of the economic troubles that we've had recently. And so maybe this is some fundamental reform of banking regulations. Well, if I'm a member of the American Bankers Association, then I'm going to go and talk to, let's say, to these officials, including maybe Claire McCaskill. And let's say I happen to come in there and I find that Senator McCaskill is actually on the floor debating some other legislation. And I'll say, well, could you put me in charge, put me in touch with the person who's in charge of domestic policy or banking, particularly banking or economic policy, who works with Senator McCaskill in crafting banking regulations. And they say, oh yeah, well that's our person over here, Deborah. We'll have you meet Deborah, and Deborah can talk to you about that. So we get to meet a member of Senator McCaskill's staff who deals with banking regulations. And so I strike up a relationship, a conversation with this person, Deborah, and basically talk to her about my views about Senate Bill 222. Now, Deborah is very familiar with Senate Bill 222 because her job is to stay on top of regulations and reform and things that are going on in Washington, in particular legislation or pending legislation that's going on that pertains to the economy and specifically banking. So she's very familiar with Senate Bill 222. And I may tell her that I'm concerned about certain provisions of this bill that I think overly hurt the banking industry. And I'm trying to suggest to her some certain changes that ought to be made. Or there may be another bill that's much more favorable to our interest, and I'll say, Senate Bill 223 is actually a better bill that really reflects more the interest of America and helps the economy better, and certainly also helps the banking industry better too. So in any case, we're talking about some of the specifics of legislation that is before Congress, that's being considered before Congress right now. And so it's a process, we're talking to her and letting her know our views. And in the process of that, I may actually say, so, and by the way, Deborah, can we go out and have lunch? Can we continue our conversation over lunch? The point I'm trying to do as a lobbyist is I'm trying to get access to Deborah as well as to Senator McCaskill. And I'm hoping that even in this case, if I haven't met Senator McCaskill, through my contacts with Deborah, we're in the process of developing a relationship, that at some point in time during a staff meeting that Senator McCaskill has with Deborah, and Senator McCaskill is saying, well, what are my constituents are saying about Senate Bill 222, and what is your opinion about the costs and the benefits of Senate Bill 222? I'm hoping that Deborah will repeat some of the things to Senator McCaskill that I said to Deborah about why Senate Bill 222 is a good bill or why it's a bad bill or what needs to be changed in that particular bill. That reflects my interest. And to the extent that I've won over my arguments with Deborah, then I've actually doing my job in terms of helpfully influencing Senator McCaskill. And so I'll meet with lobbyists. I will meet with various staff members of Congress as part of this. And of course, if I can meet with the actual House of Representatives, the representatives or the senators themselves, that's even better. And that's why we're going to receptions and so forth, hopefully to meet these members of Congress as well. Again, to share our views, to try to influence them in terms of accepting our viewpoints. All right? So, and that's just sort of a little brief example of how interest groups operate with members of Congress in trying to influence public policy. Now, as part of that too, these interest groups will also do the same thing with members of bureaucracy. Again, talking about government officials. Another example would be, for example, not only in terms of having staff members of Congress going to these receptions, but I know, for example, when I worked for the Bureau of Export Administration, General Electric was always throwing a big reception for our department and encouraging us to go there. And again, with the idea of trying to cultivate relationships. And if they met you and knew that you played a key role in decision making, in this case in terms of export license applications, again, they would try to befriend you, try to provide information to you, try to help develop, the process of developing that relationship, help you see the perspective of the interest group as to why you should adopt this policy. Or there might be, again, maybe new regulations that were coming up, maybe new regulations that govern the transfer of technology, maybe some technical specification or highly technical regulations, and trying to encourage members of the bureaucracy to create regulations that reflect the interest of that particular interest group. The Computer Software Manufacturers Association, that would be very much concerned about export controls that govern the exportation of computer software. All right? The aerospace industry, very much concerned about the export of airplanes and high-tech aerospace components, and trying to make sure that in this case, the Commerce Department was writing regulations that were reflective of their interest. So I'm saying all this basically to make sure you understand that interest groups, what they're trying to do is they're trying to influence policy. They're trying to influence policy, first of all, through meeting with members of Congress and influencing the nature of the nature of legislation. The laws that are being passed, they're wanting to make sure that those laws reflect the interest of or prerogatives of that particular interest group. So they're trying to influence members of Congress, and they're also trying to influence members of the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is taking these administrative agencies, Department of State, Department of Labor, and so forth, are taking laws that are passed by Congress and implementing these laws. And they're wanting to make sure that the laws that are implemented through regulation and the passage of regulation also reflects the interest of that group. Okay, so again, you see through Congress and through bureaucracy how interest groups are trying to influence public policy. All right, so that's all the whole part of the lobbying effort, trying to get laws that reflect their interest and regulations that reflect their interest passed into measure. This is probably a pretty good stopping point in terms of our discussion of interest groups. When we come back in our next segment, we're going to continue discussing the role of interest groups, and particularly we'll talk about the role of interest groups as they pertain to something called the Iron Triangle, and whether or not interest groups are good for our society or not good for our society. So until next time, this is Patrick Scott. See you next time.